We talked about how to make the tea. Other materials that you'll need to prepare an herb jelly are a large pot for hot water bath canning, a smaller saucepan to make the jelly and the tea in. You'll need canning jars. I usually work in pretty small batches. These are new jars. You can use jars that you've used before because we'll sterilize the glass. The bands don't need to be sterile, they can just be washed because they don't come in contact with the jelly. And you will want to make sure that you're using new lids. So if you have jars that you've used before, you can buy separately just the lids for the jars. Basically, they have this rubber seal on the inside, and that only works once to the best extent. So what happens when you're canning is you put your jar into the water, boiling water, and the air inside the jar will escape as it's boiling. So the band holds this lid in place, and then when you remove it from the hot water bath, it creates a seal and a vacuum inside, which helps preserve the jelly. You'll also need some acid and sugar to help preserve and to help the pectin set. For acid, I use a cup of white vinegar and a quarter cup of lemon juice. That's more than you need for the preservation purposes of the recipe, but it helps cut through some of the sweetness and make the recipe a little bit more tangy. When you are using acid for preservation purposes, you want to make sure that you're using something that's 5% acidic. So use a bottled lemon juice or vinegar, something that can say what the percent acid is, as opposed to using a fresh lemon. For sugar, the amount of sugar you use depends a bit on the type of pectin that you have. I base this recipe on Sure-Gel low sugar pectin. So this pectin is low sugar, but it still actually requires some sugar to set. If you use a type of pectin like Pomona's, you'll need less sugar. Pomona's actually uses calcium to set and make the jelly gel, whereas these two options are easier to find, but they do require some sugar. And if you have a regular pectin that's not a low sugar variety, it'll need even more sugar to set. So just kind of I recommend reading the box and the recipe that you're using for jelly to make sure you're using the right amounts of sugar and acid. The sugar obviously will also help preserve what's inside the jelly. So my recipe calls for 3 cups of sugar, which is appropriate for this type of pectin. A few other things that might come in handy are a mesh strainer, a measuring cup. I also have this set of canning supplies, which comes with a funnel, a jar lifter, which is very handy, and then this device, which you can use to measure the air at the top of the jar, and a lid picker-upper, which is basically a magnet on the end of a stick, so you can pick the metal lids out of a jar. Alright, so I've got my tea going here. It still just has the thyme and the rose hips in it, simmering away. I'm gonna let those go for 10 minutes or so. In this pot, I have my canning situation. I'm just gonna use these to put the jars in. So I'm just using fresh jars, and I'm gonna carefully put them in. There's not enough water yet, so I wanna make sure there's enough water to cover the jars. It takes quite a bit of water, so this takes a while to boil, even with a relatively small pot. And then when you're putting the jars in, you want to make sure that you don't crack them, or try not to crack them. So having them kind of go in and not experience an intense amount of heat all at once, like kind of at an angle, helps with that process. Still, sometimes a few jars will crack. That's just part of it, I guess. I've had a few crack while I'm boiling. Also, having the grate in there, or this metal rack, helps with that too. put in 5 jars. So that that's pretty full. I'll show you. You can see what it looks like. And yeah, I'm just gonna take some time and let that come to a boil. And while I'm doing that, I will let my tea steep. So right now I'm gonna add the rest of my herbs into my tea. Alright, so my tea's been steeping for about 10 minutes now. And I'm just gonna pour it and strain it. So pour it through a strainer. It is a bright green color. It smells really nice. Alright, so I've strained my tea and just put the extra herbs in the compost that I used. And now I'm gonna measure out the tea and put it back in the pot. So I want about 4 cups. Perfect. And there's a little bit extra, which can be good to have, or to pour it in a glass to taste. But some of it will boil off when we're making the jelly. So to that mixture, I'm gonna add 3 cups of sugar. And then when I add the 1 cup of vinegar, it's gonna change the color a little bit, which is fine. Goes from like a bright green to sort of more of a reddish color, which is kind of cool to see chemistry in action. And then there will be a 1/4 cup of lemon juice, which is more for flavor than anything else. So I guess that's optional depending on your taste. So I'm gonna stir this to mix that in and bring it back onto the heat. We are gonna stir it for a while to bring it up to a vigorous boil. All right, so now, kind of perfect timing, both my pots have come to a boil. This one that has the jars sterilizing in it, I wanna make sure boils for 10 minutes, at least 10 minutes, just to get the jars sterilized. And now that this one's boiling, you want it at a temperature where it is a boil that won't stir down. I'm gonna add the pectin. I'm gonna use this ball pectin. Of course, that makes the water boil up, so I'm gonna turn that off. For a minute. And I'll bring it back to a boil. Now I want it on high heat and to bring it up to a high temperature because the pectin needs sugar and acid to set. It also needs to be brought up to a high temperature. So think a boil that you can't stir down, or kind of as hot as you can get it. Or if you have a thermometer, you can try and get it up to 220 degrees Fahrenheit. I was reading in Michelle Jeuneste's cookbook about making herb. She has a Yukon herb jelly recipe in there, which doesn't have Labrador tea, but has wormwood and some other local plants. And she's saying how jelly making is just kind of hard sometimes and depends on the weather and the humidity that day. There's a lot of factors that aren't always in your control. This is looking good. We can also take a sample of the tea that I made earlier. This, of course, will taste different than this because it's got the sugar and the vinegar in it. But the tea that I made, you can taste the Labrador tea in there. It has a lot of Labrador tea. It's very foresty tasting. Kind of what it looks like from above. But it's boiling pretty strongly, and that'll reduce it down quite a bit as well. While I'm doing that, I'm gonna dip a little bit of this hot water from my canning jar and just put it in a bowl. I've got my lids in here, and they don't need to be, they already are sterile kind of when they come out of the box, but I just want to warm them up so that the rubber works well. All right, after 10 minutes, we can take the jars out of the bath and obviously do this carefully because the water is hot. That's why it's nice to have these grippers. Put them, if they're hot, once they're hot, able to handle them, you can leave them upside down for a minute and then turn them right side out so they're dry. We want to work quickly during this part so that the glass stays warm. So the idea is that the whole jelly and the glass all is warm when it goes back into the bath, so that it's to temperature. Okay, fix my rack in there. I want the water to stay hot, so I'm gonna leave that going. And then let me just shift this so that you can see what I'm gonna do over here. Got my lids. I'm gonna grab a clean paper towel just to wipe off the rims in case I spill a little bit. But I can also use this funnel to help fill. I like to leave a little bit of headspace in the jar. And you need to leave a little bit just so that this air is kind of what creates the vacuum seal when you're put it back in the hot water bath, canning them. So you can measure, this thing also comes with a tool, you can measure how much you have, and that is at 1/4 inch, which is pretty good. Some of them are a little bit more, but we let our house freeze, so I want to have at least that 1/4 inch in there. I'm going to wipe off the tops to make sure they're clean and that they can create a good seal. I have a little bit of extra jelly. I can use that maybe in a different container to make refrigerator jelly. And then can carefully place them on top. You don't want to touch the underneath side to make sure it stays sterile. And then the bands want to go on about finger tight, so not too tight, just to basically hold the lid in place so that it can create the seal. So you definitely don't want to wrench down on them, because what you want is for when it goes back into the hot water bath, for the air that's inside here to come out, because as it heats up, that'll expand and it'll leave the jar, and then when you take it out of the hot water bath, it'll seal and there'll be a vacuum in there, and that's what preserves the food or the jar. It's still boiling. Might slow down once I put these in. Again, this is the part where you want to be careful not to crack the jars. It can help to kind of like put them in slowly at an angle. Okay, one more. There we go. So now the water's like quite high up there. I'm going to take a little bit of it out. You can see the air bubbles coming out from the jars. That's the vacuum sealing happening. We're going to bring the pot up to a rolling boil again, and then we're going to let it process for 5 minutes. But we're not going to start the timer until it's boiling. That is important. You want to make sure there's like an inch or so of water covering the jars, so you want to make sure there's enough water, but not too much that it's coming out the top. All right, my hot water bath's been going for 5 minutes, so I can turn it off and take the jars out. Jelly, because it's water-based or watery, takes less time in the hot water bath than something like a jam or a chutney might, which has more like vegetables and things that need to heat through. So make sure, depending on what you're canning, that you look at your recipe and check that time. And that pop is the sound that happens when the jars start to seal. So you want to wait, and sometimes it takes a little while, but they should do that after they come out. You can maybe get rid of some of the extra water, but you don't want to push them down and make them seal on their own. So just let them do their thing. This is a jar of hibiscus wine jelly that I made earlier this spring, but it's still sealed, and when you tap on it, it kind of makes a different sound than something that's more hollow. This one's an herb jelly that I made earlier that's open, just to show you what it looks like when it's cooled and finished. It's kind of like this nice golden color. This one I made earlier had a nice gel on it, and it tastes kind of like herby, sweet and tangy. We'll just let these cool. Hopefully they all seal. If they don't seal, just keep them in the fridge and use them first. Use them like a refrigerator jelly. And don't forget to label what they are and when you made them so you can keep track of them in the future.